I was a writer for a while. I was in the Navy for a while. Discovered woodworking as a way of sort of mending my injured soul after the 60s, and wound up turning woodworking into boat building, and boat building back into sailing, and here we go. Everything comes around full circle.
The militia orders were simple. They were to build the forts until they were ready to defend themselves. They were to man those forts when there was any kind of a threat against them by British campaigning, and they were to raise a siege should the British mount a surprise campaign against West Point.
Hello, I'm Brian Madden. Welcome aboard. We're on the Gaviota, a boat that's just coming in on the Rondout Creek. We've been out this afternoon with Andy Mele here. He has the Hudson Valley Spirit, a racing catamaran that's making a lot of waves these days. We're going to tell you all about it and show you right here on the river. When we first ventured out to do this particular report, we were all set to hop aboard a catamaran called the Hudson Valley Spirit, which we'll do anyway. But we became more and more aware as we did this report that the man behind this 38-foot racing boat is as much, if not more, of a Hudson Valley Spirit himself, raised in the mountains and living now on the river. So we'll find out about two spirits here, the boat and the man, Andy Mele. Already, we've met Andy's wife, Marita Lopez Mena. In Logbook 3, you remember, she told of the Maritime Center she operates in Kingston. But what we didn't mention then was the boat building shop next door and the catamaran out back on the Rondout Creek, a boat that came in first in a series of international speed racing events this past summer between New York and Boston. The Hudson Valley Spirit even beat the 85-foot La Liberté, which came over from France to partake of the Statue of Liberty ceremonies and Albany's tricentennial. But before we get into the boat, let's hear from Andy Mele about his boyhood in Woodstock and how it led to his pursuit of the open waters.
As I grew up, I began to realize and to learn more about the marine background in my family, which had not been apparent at first. Both my folks were writers and typical Woodstock types. We lived in a little sapling house on the Maverick Road that had been built by Hervey White. Wonderful place to grow up. No running water, wood stove for the first 12 years of my life. Then I learned that my great-grandfather was captain of the battleship Maine. At the time it was blown up in Havana.
Was he on it?
He was on it, yeah. He wasn't killed. He went on to be given the command of the largest ship in the Navy. It was their way of saying, we don't think you screwed up. Here's our biggest ship, you know. Before that, he'd been a pioneer oceanographer, and when I was in the Navy...
What was his name?
His name was Foxy Sigsbee, Charles Dwight Sigsbee, nicknamed Foxy. There's a Sigsbee Deep off the California coast that I sailed over many times. There was a destroyer named the Sigsbee after him also, which had been decommissioned shortly after I went in. My uncle, Antonato Fisher, also a Woodstock resident who died in '62, I think, was a marine artist. And I learned a lot about the sea in his studio and at visiting his house, my aunt and he. And, of course, looking at his pictures and reading his books and whatnot. Another great uncle was a founder of the Annapolis Naval Academy. His son was an Arctic explorer who died on the Greeley expedition, wrote a book called Farthest North, which of course was published posthumously, he having died on, like everybody else, on the Greeley expedition, but he was the farthest man north in history up to that point. Between that and going to Washington to visit a bunch of other naval relatives at holidays, I began to realize that I had a terrific maritime past. And gradually just became interested in boats. By the time I was 16, I was working in a marina here for a naval architect who was a fixture in Rondout, a guy named Cordon Baxter, who, even though he was mean as a bear, was still very pleasant to me and taught me a lot of stuff. And I remained friends with him for years and years until he passed away a few years ago. Then I was a writer for a while. I was in the Navy for a while, discovered woodworking as a way of sort of mending my injured soul after the 60s, and wound up turning woodworking into boat building, and boat building back into sailing, and here we go. Everything comes around full circle.
It was aboard the Gaviota that we spent a recent afternoon with Andy Mele as he watched his crew tack and jibe on the Hudson in preparation for the Governor's Cup race held last weekend in New York Harbor. The crew here, by the way, consists of Chris Cole of Red Hook, Nancy Lofaro and Jerry Burley of Woodstock, Sergei Sikorsky of Kingston, and Peter Cricker of Saugerties.
Chris is handing in the Genoa to save time stripping it through the winch, and they bear off, snoot full of wind, and here they come to impale us with one of those hulls.
They're not going to hit us, are they?
Oh, I don't know. It's part of the excitement of the sport. Oh, now they got a little more wind. Look at that. There we go. Good bow wave.
Smooth.
Smooth, yes.
In order to get the Hudson Valley Spirit on the water and operating, it took a lot of energy, it took effort, and of course, money.
I am, of course, a boat builder, have been one for 15 or so years. And at one point, almost accidentally, I wound up building a multi-hull, a cruising racing trimaran. And while I was building this boat, I became so enthusiastic about the hull shapes, the underwater efficiency of these long, skinny hulls, that I started looking more and more into multi-hulls. And with the net result that I became fairly conversant with a lot of the stuff that's going on, especially what's going on in Europe, which is a huge commercial racing scene, like Formula One car racing. Hours upon hours of live television coverage and stuff like that all over Europe. Big commercial sponsorship, multi-million-dollar budgets, and so yeah, the logical thought was, can it happen here? It should happen here. There's 20 times the volume of the sheer dollar volume of business in this country than there is in France, particularly, which is the leader in this stuff. So I started working on the state government, figuring that a regional sponsorship would have the best chance for getting media attention and so on and so forth. And that was 2 years ago. The boat was to be called New York Spirit, and we actually started doing some design work, and I did get some donations. We started a nonprofit corporation. And then it became apparent that we were going to run into political difficulties with any of the state agencies, and we sort of pulled in our horns.
How was that so? Political difficulty?
Boats. Boats represent different things to different people. Yachts. Like, you see what Mario Cuomo gets in trouble with now, right? He gets in trouble no matter what he does. And politicians just get to the point where they don't need any extra help getting in trouble. And if Cuomo was to say, who's the fellow who's attacking him now? I can't remember his name. The guy with the cardboard cutouts who's running for governor. I shouldn't say that. Excuse me. Anyhow, this guy could make great hay with the business of Mario's private yacht, New York Spirit, and all the publicity, no matter how good it was. So we're trying to work that out. At latest discussion, it was a waterfront foundation that was going to help outfits like the Maritime Center and museums and institutions and communities all over the state, fisheries and so on, helping protect the working aspects of the waterfront. Anyhow, that's in a condition of stasis right now. And this boat was donated. The boat was owned by a client of mine. He had a bunch of work done on the boat at my shop. Donated the boat to the museum after a season of racing. And lo and behold, we decided to call it Hudson Valley Spirit, downscaling the thing into this nice bite-sized budget. And Jackie Ring became involved. Sergei and I, the fellow I was talking with about the Governor's Cup, I should have introduced you. Sergei Sikorsky, associate of mine. He and I gave Jackie and Mike Bolger a big pitch about this stuff, and they flipped, and they went
Jackie,
to Jackie,
of course, with an advertising marketing
agency, and Mike Bolger, the same. They went and pitched, I'm going to turn around and get back down there. They went and gave the pitch to Avis, and it was just immediately accepted. And the rest is what's happened. There have been several $1,000s worth of other private individuals giving money, lots of donated services and whatnot. So it hasn't all been Avis by any means.
And you can still use a few more bucks, I
And we can
understand.
still use a few more bucks, you bet.
A necessary part of what it takes to keep a
race
boat
to run this
afloat
week.
and competitive. Sponsorship money. In this case, for the summer racing season, $40,000. The Hudson Valley Spirit is owned and operated by the Maritime Center in Kingston, as is the boat we're aboard, the Gaviota. It is home port, and now putting the valley on the international racing map. And as for the Gaviota, Andy tells a river tale that took place just over a year ago when Hurricane Gloria came blowing through.
Of course, out here it was blowing its socks off 60, 70 miles an hour. So we went out and pulled them off the rocks. And then we're confronted. The wind was coming right out of the north, blowing straight down the river. How to make a 90-degree turn and thread the needle into the creek without the houseboat, which has a tremendous amount of windage, just getting blown right down onto the south jetty while we were headed in. So we had two boats, and we had to sort of maneuver over here very close, and we took a tow line. No, we had the tow line on the houseboat. Our other boat got another tow line and started to make the turn. And at the exact moment they were headed at 90 degrees to the river, into the creek, we dropped the tow line, he took the load and went zipping right in. We made a big U-turn and came alongside and played tugboat alongside under the lee of the houseboat to keep him up off the jetty, and we made it in. And an hour later, it was all calm. You know, here it was shrieking wind. Everything was like white with spray, mountainous seas. I've never seen anything like it. We took green water up against, like solid water up against these windows. It was incredible. One of the wildest adventures of my life. I loved it. We all loved it. It was a great experience.
Don't be surprised if sometime soon you'll be hearing about how the Hudson Valley Spirit, both the boat and the man, finally got around to breaking a speed sailing record that has stood for 120 years, from New York to Albany or vice versa, in under 14 hours. All Andy Mele needs is a good wind at his back, and of course, an ace crew.
Great. You guys just look fabulous.
To many people now, the Hudson River means entertainment, pleasure cruises, sightseeing, and swimming. But did you know there was a time when the river held a great military value? In 1775, the Hudson was considered a lifeline for the colonists. They relied on it for transporting supplies and agricultural goods, and to provide protection for the highlands, which, if lost, would leave the colonists at the mercy of the Indians. It was then West Point soon became of great strategic military importance, as we learned from Lieutenant Colonel Ken Hamburger.
Hudson River is tidal all the way up to Albany, and the only real difficulty for big ships, even today, and certainly at the time of the Revolution, is right here at West Point, where you have two right-angle turns that the ship has to make in getting around. If you picture for yourself the 18th century men of war with three masts powered only by their sails and the wind, you can realize the difficulty they'd have making the two tight turns here at West Point. The colonists realized this, and the first act that they did during the Revolution was to decide where they were going to fortify the Hudson. The Hudson River, they thought, was the key to holding the colonies together. It gave communications from north to south, and gave transportation for the New England farmers to get their wares to the southern farmers, and the southern grain and agriculture growers to get their wares north. It also provided an invasion route to Canada if the colonists ever decided they had the ability to invade Canada. At the time of the Revolution, the Hudson Highlands here were cut by only two roads, east-west, and two north-south trails. When you think of roads in that time, you have to remember that a highway by law could have stumps no higher than 1 foot, and a normal journey from New York to Philadelphia was a week's trip. This meant that the Hudson Highlands were a very important resource for the colonists because it allowed them a covered area to work from where the British armies would have a lot more difficulty operating than the colonial militia. The river was also an important logistics route for the colonists to be able to move the supplies they needed from New England to the southern colonies, the leather, the hides, the horses, and the manufactured goods that were New England specialties to the southern colonies, and to get the agricultural goods from the southern colonies up to the north. Strategic control of the Hudson River would split the colonies northeast from southwest. They would reduce Washington's ability to move his army from the colonies to the south, and it would mean that the British would not have to keep a force in Canada to help defend the Canadian provinces. First act of the Continental Congress was to resolve to hold the Hudson, and they sent a reconnaissance team north to decide exactly where to do it. That team decided there were several sites, but the most important of those would be the area right at West Point, where the ships would have the most difficulty getting around the point. They recommended 300 men across on Constitution Island, about 200 men on the West Point side, and a boom across the river to block the river. This wasn't the first time that a boom or a chain had been used to block ships in a passage like that. They'd been used earlier in the siege of Malta, at Constantinople, and even in Quebec in North America. They formed a committee to fortify the West Point, and hired an engineer, Bernard Romans, who was actually a cartographer turned military engineer. When he came north, he determined that Constitution Island was the critical place to fortify. Unfortunately, Constitution Island, as you can see, is dominated by West Point. It is a big flat island, doesn't have a real good source of fresh water. And worst of all, the ships making the turns around West Point are almost underway again before batteries on Constitution Island could bring them under fire. There were no real obstacles to a land attack of Constitution Island, and above all, Bernard Romans' plans there were just too grandiose for the colonists to be able to afford in either time, men, or money. By December of 1775, a congressional committee had visited the works on Constitution Island and determined that it was the wrong place to fortify, and instead moved the focus south to the area of where Bear Mountain Bridge is now, and ordered both Fort Clinton and Fort Montgomery built at the mouth of Popolopan Creek, and a chain to be strung across in the area that the Bear Mountain Bridge now occupies. They did allow Romans to continue his work on Constitution Island. By the following spring, Benjamin Franklin was on a mission to try to enlist Canada as the 14th colony. Happened to stop with his party at Constitution Island, and he was appalled with what he saw. He saw it as a waste of the colonists' meager resources, and wrote Washington that he should re-examine the fortifications at West Point. By June of that summer, 1776, Washington assumed personal responsibilities for the fortresses in the area and sent Lord Stirling, Colonel Rufus Putnam, and Colonel Henry Knox up to inspect. They looked at the fortress on Constitution Island and deemed it a quaint and indefensible extravagance. Ordered the committee disbanded and get one good engineer to arrange and organize the fortresses at West Point. By October 1776, the chain was across down at Anthony's Nose, the Bear Mountain Bridge area. It broke twice in getting it across, and it was March of 1777 before they finally had it in place. By the summer of 1777, you had fortresses all up and down the Hudson. You had the obstacles up between Palopal Island, which is now more often called Bannerman's Island, and Plum Point. You had the fortresses on Constitution Island, and down at where Bear Mountain Bridge is, you had three fortresses: Fort Independence, Fort Clinton, Fort Montgomery, and on down south, the fortress at Stony Point. In a way, all of these were open to landward attacks. Washington was worried about this and had ordered all the commanders to prepare for defenses on the landward side. Unfortunately, none of them did, and the British took advantage of that in October of 1777 when General Clinton ordered an attack on the Popolopan forts, and in a 30-minute bayonet attack from the landward side, destroyed the Forts Clinton, Fort Montgomery, broke the great chain in that area, and then burned the fortresses and withdrew. If this had been an attack that was expected to succeed on its own, it would have been a wonderful success. Unfortunately, it was an attack which was supposed to support General Burgoyne, who was attacking south toward Albany and who had just been defeated at Saratoga. So although the burning of the forts at Clinton and Montgomery were a big setback for the colonists, it wasn't nearly as big as if Burgoyne had been successful at Saratoga. In a way, it was a favor that the British did the colonists because it wiped out the fortifications on the Hudson and let them start all over with a new perspective. This one was focused on West Point. By now, Franklin was in Paris, and he had hired 4 French engineers to come over and advise the colonists. They recommended that West Point be the area of fortification. Unfortunately, their ideas for fortifying West Point were in the style of fortifications that was then popular in Europe, especially those promoted by the Frenchman Vauban. They were huge fortresses which were generally meant to surround a city with geometric stone walls which would allow a city to withstand a siege lasting anywhere from weeks to months before a relieving army could come and lift the siege. Obviously, this wasn't what the colonists needed. They didn't have a large city to be fortified. They only had the area of West Point to be fortified. There were no great number of inhabitants, and the only purpose of the fortresses here was to defend the chain and the river batteries which were down at water level from attack from the landward side. What the colonists planned was to put batteries down at water level, what is now the navigation feature of West Point, huge muzzle-loading cannons which would fire solid cannonballs into the sides of the British ships. All the British ships were built of oak. They're pinned together with elm pins, and the way that you would destroy these ships was not by making a hole in the side, the way modern naval artillery does, but rather by shaking that ship apart. The origination of the phrase "shiver my timbers" was from shaking the timbers of this ship apart and causing it to sink. Obviously, if they had nothing but the batteries down at water level, that would be easy for a British army to come up here, attack from the landward side, and put those batteries out of action. So they planned a complex of fortifications. Fort Clinton would be the main one at the lower level. It would defend the water batteries and the chain. There'd be others over on Constitution Island, and then the high ground would be dominated by the fortresses up at what's now Fort Putnam. At that time it was not yet named. All of these would then be surrounded by fortifications on the outside which would prevent what happened at Fort Clinton and Fort Montgomery from happening at West Point. That is, they would have made a surprise attack impossible. Although the British could attack, it would only be through all these ring of fortifications. The attack would be broken up, it would be disorganized before it ever got to the chain and the river batteries. The French engineers recommended West Point because the ships would have to slow almost to a stop, and because the heights here on the West Point side would dominate the river just as we're looking down on it now. It also had West Point has a nice open valley down toward New Jersey and Pennsylvania, which would allow the militia to come and either assist in defending the fortresses here, to help build them, or to relieve a siege if the British attacked in that manner. Winter was setting in by the time that the British had destroyed the southern forts, and there was little work that winter. Finally, in January the following year, 1778, General Samuel Parsons came across the river on the ice and encamped here on the West Point plain, and that was the original occupation of West Point, which has remained occupied by U.S. forces to this day. Nonetheless, it was slow work. There was little planning through that winter. There wasn't much effort to fortify these highlands that were so critical to the defense of West Point, and there was little more work over on Constitution Island. Congress said that something had to be done. They had ordered the chain for West Point. It was going to be available by the spring of 1778, and they needed something to defend it. The colonists were good with the spade and the axe, and they began building earth and wood fortifications instead of the grandiose stone fortifications that the French engineers had wanted. In March of 1778, one of the real heroes of West Point arrived, Tadeusz Kosciuszko. He'd been born in Poland, had fought in some of the wars in Europe, and he'd come to America in 1776. He had been the engineer at the Ticonderoga and the Saratoga campaigns, and there he had learned the difficulty of trying to hold a fortress which is dominated by high ground where the enemy can get cannons. He had recommended taking high ground at Ticonderoga to prevent the enemy from getting cannons there. The commander had disapproved that, but he had had the experience of seeing Fort Ticonderoga fall because the British did exactly what he had predicted. He was partly responsible for this change in plans to stop the big grandiose plans of the French engineers and to use wood and earth to build colonial forts, and particularly to fortify the hills around the outside. He began planning the defense in depth. He ordered the building of Fort Meigs, Fort Willis, and Fort Webb down on the Lusk Ridge to dominate the two valleys through which British armies could come north. The one right down at river level, and the one which is now blocked by Lusk Reservoir near the Mikey Stadium. The work throughout the period of the Revolution all went on in fits and starts and was never really completed, but it was complete enough that the British never mounted a real campaign against West Point.
Well, there you have it. We took you aboard the Hudson Valley Spirit and to West Point, where history certainly has made its mark felt. We're coming in now aboard the Gaviota and hope you join us next week right here on the river.